The day death arrived in Dorset, they didn't know it at the time. They didn't hear the footsteps of what was coming. On an ordinary summer's day in the year 1348, a ship quietly arrived at the harbor of Melcombe Regis, now part of Weymouth in Dorset, England. The sun rose as it always had, seagulls screamed over the bustling port, and townsfolk went about their day, unaware that death had just crept ashore. The ship came from Gascony in southern France, a region already gripped by a strange and horrifying sickness. On board were merchants, crewmen, and rats. Not ordinary rats, but plague-infested rodents carrying a silent killer inside them. A microscopic organism that no one could see, no one could understand, and no one could stop. It was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the Black Death. As the ship docked, rats spilled onto the quayside, carrying fleas that had feasted on infected blood. The fleas, in turn, began to bite humans. Within days, the first signs of illness appeared: fevers, chills, excruciating pain. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that turned black and oozed. The name Black Death would come later, but its horror began here, in the narrow streets of Dorset. At first, people dismissed it as a local sickness, a fever brought by foreign winds perhaps, something that would pass. But the days turned into nightmares. Victims collapsed in the streets, priests began burying entire families. And the dead, they came in waves, so many, so fast that there was no time for mourning, no time for coffins, just shallow pits and cartloads of corpses. The air reeked of decay and despair. From Melcombe Regis, the plague fanned out like a wildfire, traveling inland through trade routes, across fields and rivers, into towns and villages. Within weeks, it had reached Bristol, and from there, it would continue its deadly march across the rest of England. The people had no defenses. Medical knowledge in the 14th century was rudimentary at best. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God, a result of sin and corruption. Others thought it came from bad air, miasma, or even from the alignment of planets. The true cause, the bacteria carried by fleas on rats, would not be discovered for centuries. And so they turned to desperate measures. Some whipped themselves in public as an act of penance. Others lit fires in the streets to drive away the evil air. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, hoping to protect themselves. Nothing worked. The mortality rate was staggering. In some places, it's believed that up to 60% of the population died. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Commerce ground to a halt. Churches, once the spiritual centers of medieval life, were overwhelmed with bodies. Even priests and monks, those meant to guide others to the afterlife, fell in droves. By the time the Black Death had run its course in England, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population was gone. That's over 2 million people, silenced in just a few years. It changed everything. Labor shortages gave peasants new bargaining power, leading to social unrest, and eventually revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The rigid structure of feudalism began to crack. Landowners, desperate for workers, had to pay more and grant freedoms once unthinkable. The very fabric of English society was altered because of a ship that docked in Dorset. The arrival at Melcombe Regis is one of the most chilling moments in British history, because it marks not just the entry point of a pandemic, but the ignition point of transformation. Before the plague, England was a nation of growing cities, expanding trade, and relative optimism. After, it was a landscape of grief and ghosts. Families broken, lineages ended, villages erased from maps forever. Even centuries later, echoes of that moment remain. The plague never fully disappeared. It returned in waves over the following centuries, each time awakening memories of that first unthinkable horror. Today, in the quiet town of Weymouth, there's little to mark the spot. No grand monument stands at the harbor. No memorial cries out the names of the first to die. But history remembers. It remembers how death arrived not with a roar, but a whisper. A ship docking on a sunny day, rats scurrying unseen, and a silence falling over Dorset that would spread like shadow across all of England. In modern times, we understand more about disease, about how it spreads, how it mutates, how to fight it. But even with all our knowledge, the story of Malcolm Regis serves as a warning that pandemics begin quietly, that they don't wait for permission, and that sometimes history pivots on the smallest of things, a flea, a rat, a ship's anchor dropped in the wrong harbor. That day in 1348 was more than just a local tragedy. It was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history, and it all began with the arrival of death in Dorset, the village that locked itself to die. In the heart of the English countryside lies a village so quiet, so seemingly ordinary, you'd never guess it once made one of the most haunting and selfless decisions in human history. This is not a myth. This is not a fable. This is the story of Thames, the village that locked itself in to die. The year was 1665. London was choking under the grip of the Great Plague. Fleas carried on the backs of black rats were spreading the bubonic plague faster than fire through dry grass. In the city, tens of thousands perished. Corpses lined the streets. Entire households vanished within days. And from that chaos, a parcel traveled, innocently, quietly, from London to the small Derbyshire village of Thames. Inside, cloth, damp, flea-infested cloth. It was sent to the local tailor, Alexander Hadfield. His assistant, George Vickers, was the first to handle it. Within days, Vickers fell violently ill. High fever, black buboes, classic signs of the plague. Soon after, he was dead. Thames, home to only around 350 people, had unknowingly invited the plague in. At first, the villagers did what most would do: panic, denial, flee. But here's where Thames' story becomes something else entirely, something chilling and astonishing. Their rector, William Mompesson, a man of both faith and reason, recognized the horror they were facing. He knew the plague was not done. He also knew what could happen if the villagers scattered. The infection would follow them into neighboring towns and villages, into farms, into cities, into homes where children were sleeping. If Thames ran, the death toll wouldn't stop at a few hundred. It could reach thousands, tens of thousands. So Mompesson, together with his predecessor and eventual ally Thomas Stanley, a Puritan minister with different beliefs but a shared moral backbone, proposed the unthinkable, that Thames seal itself off from the world. No one would leave, no one would enter. Thames would become a human barrier, a living tomb. They asked their people to stay, to face the plague willingly, to die if it meant others might live, and they said yes. The village drew a boundary, a literal ring around itself. No one crossed it. Supplies were left at the edge of the village at marked stone borders called the boundary stones. Coins, soaked in vinegar as a crude disinfectant, were left in exchange for food and medicine. And then they waited and died. One by one, homes went silent. Families buried their dead in their own gardens, too afraid to use the village cemetery. The toll was relentless. Entire households were wiped out. The village gravedigger buried his own children, one after another, and continued his grim duty alone. The plague did not discriminate. It took bakers, blacksmiths, infants, elders, and priests. The rector himself lost his wife, Catherine, who chose to stay by his side. She could have fled with their children, but she didn't. She died in August of 1666. He buried her in the churchyard alone, and still the people of Thames stayed. Imagine that choice. Imagine watching your neighbors waste away, your friends choke on their last breath, your own family bleed and swell and suffer, and knowing you could have escaped. That salvation lay just beyond the hills. And still, choosing to stay, choosing to suffer, choosing to become a wall against death for the sake of strangers you'd never meet. Some went mad. Others became quiet and hollow, burying 5, 10, even 15 loved ones with their own hands. The village's population was decimated. Of the original 350 residents, over 260 died in just over a year. That's 3 out of every 4 people. But it worked. The plague never spread to the nearby towns. Sheffield, just miles away, was spared. Bakewell, Tideswell. They lived because Ayam chose to die. By November 1666, the disease had finally burned through the village, with no new victims. Ayam began to breathe again, but it was a different village. It was a graveyard with standing houses. Survivors were few, and many were left utterly alone. But what they did changed history. In an age of ignorance and superstition, Ayam stood as a monument of discipline, moral courage, and sacrifice. They understood contagion before it was science. They practiced early forms of quarantine before the word existed in everyday vocabulary. And they didn't do it under royal decree or military threat. They chose it, voluntarily, together. Today, the story of Ayam is rarely taught, overshadowed by louder wars, grander tragedies, and more dramatic heroics. But in its quiet, horrific, self-inflicted isolation, Ayam revealed something very rare: the ability of ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices. When death came knocking, they did not flee. They opened the gates, shut the doors behind them, and turned themselves into a firewall to protect the world beyond. There are still gravestones in Ayam, still the boundary stone with its coin-hollowed crevices. Still the Riley graves, where one woman buried her husband and 6 children within 8 days. And still the church where William Mumpison gave sermons from the hills so the villagers could listen without standing too close. What happened in Ayam was not just a story of death. It was a story of choice, of the invisible threads that bind people not by blood, but by principle. In a world today where fear often drives division, Ayam stands as a chilling reminder that true courage isn't always loud. It's sometimes the quiet, final decision to stay. When every instinct says, run, the village that locked itself in, to die, saved thousands who would never know their names. And in doing so, they carved their story into the bones of history. One grave, one sacrifice, one silent act of defiance at a time. The night the monks stopped ringing the bells, they say silence is louder when it follows centuries of sound. And on one cold night in 1349, England heard a silence it would never forget, the silence of bells that would never ring again. For generations, monasteries were the heartbeat of the medieval world. Towering stone abbeys stood like sentinels across the English countryside. Within their walls, monks lived lives of strict devotion, praying, copying manuscripts, healing the sick, and most famously, ringing the bells that called entire villages to worship, to mourn, to celebrate, and to repent. These bells were the voice of God to the people. But then came a visitor no one could exorcise: the Black Death. It arrived like a whisper and struck like a hammer. First through the ports, then the villages, then the cloisters. The disease didn't discriminate. It spared no king, no peasant, and no man of God. Monks, who were often the first to comfort the dying, were also the first to fall. They opened their doors to the sick, because that's what they believed Christ would have done, and by doing so, they signed their own death warrants. Across England, entire monastic communities were wiped out within weeks. In some places, the bells tolled relentlessly for days as death came one after another, until finally they stopped. Not because death was done, but because there were no hands left to ring them. Monks had been not just spiritual leaders, but also doctors, herbalists, scribes, and scholars. They were the caretakers of medieval medicine and record-keeping. When the monasteries fell silent, it wasn't just the sound that vanished. It was the very infrastructure of knowledge, charity, and stability. Sick villagers who had once come to the abbeys for aid now found only cold stone and corpses. The dying cried out, but the halls were empty. The altar candles burned low, unattended, and went out. In Ely, in York, in the vast monasteries of Westminster and Winchester, chroniclers who survived wrote of eerie days when the only sound was the wind moving through deserted cloisters. Bells, once symbols of eternal rhythm, lay rusted. Some ropes were found clenched in the stiff hands of the last monks who had tried to continue their holy duty even as fever took hold. By some estimates, over half the monks in England died in the first wave of the Black Death alone. Some abbeys saw their entire population perish. Others were so reduced they could no longer function as religious institutions. In many regions, monasteries were abandoned entirely. The great stone structures, once filled with psalms and chants, now echoed with crows and decay. One chronicler from Worcester wrote that the priests died faster than the people, for they embraced the death of others. They weren't being poetic. The disease was so contagious, so merciless, that monks often caught it just by touching a garment or saying last rites too closely. Yet they did not flee, and their sacrifice led to a paradox. The very compassion that defined monastic life became the cause of its undoing. The societal impact was catastrophic. Without monks to teach, to heal, to bless, to record, much of the countryside spiraled into spiritual and social confusion. Who would conduct Mass? Who would bury the dead? Who would write the annals of time or administer medicine to the poor? The bells had once called for order, for faith, for rhythm. Without them, the night deepened, not just in sound, but in meaning. England entered a kind of spiritual blackout. Entire generations grew up without the daily tolls of prayer, and for many it felt like God had gone silent too. There were efforts to rebuild, of course. But rebuilding a monastery wasn't just about stone. It was about people, disciplined, educated, devoted. And such people were now scarce. Some abbeys never recovered. Others turned inward, losing their purpose. Eventually, the vacuum left by dead monks allowed other powers to rise, secular lords who saw an opportunity in empty lands and powerless churches. This moment in history, quiet as it seems, was the crack before a landslide. The weakening of monasticism would ripple into future centuries. It helped pave the way for the Reformation, for the dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII, for the rise of secular knowledge outside church walls. The silence of the bells became the first death knell of an era. And still today, scattered across England, are the skeletal remains of monasteries that never rang again. Ivy-covered towers, crumbling cloisters, empty bell towers that once knew the rhythm of devotion. If you stand among those ruins at dusk, and the wind is right, you might feel it, the ghost of that silence. The night the monks stopped ringing the bells wasn't just a historical event. It was a turning point, a spiritual exhale, the end of one rhythm and the beginning of something far more uncertain. Because when the keepers of knowledge die and the bells go silent, the darkness that follows is not just physical. It's the kind of darkness that redefines an entire age. How the Black Death crushed serfdom. In England, in the year 1348, something invisible swept into the harbors of England, a ghost carried by ships and rats. It spread with a speed and cruelty the world had never seen. It was the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and in less than 2 years it would kill nearly half the population of England. But what few understood at the time was that this great dying would also become the great turning. It did not just end lives, it ended an entire way of life. Before the plague, England was a feudal society. The land was divided into manors controlled by lords who held power granted by the crown. Beneath them lived the serfs, peasants legally bound to the land. They couldn't leave, couldn't negotiate, couldn't dream. Their lives were dictated by obligation, labor in exchange for protection. They were not slaves, but they weren't free either. They owed days of their week to the fields of their lord, with little time left for their own. And when they died, their children inherited their bondage. It was a closed system, a machine that fed itself. But in 1348, the machine began to break. As the Black Death tore through the countryside, entire villages were emptied overnight. Fields were left to rot. Cows wandered untended. Priests, nobles, merchants, and peasants alike fell to the disease. But among the dead, it was the peasantry who paid the highest toll. And yet, in their absence, they gained something they'd never had before: value. With so many laborers gone, the demand for workers skyrocketed. Suddenly, lords who once treated peasants as replaceable were begging for hands to till their land, and the surviving peasants knew it. For the first time, they had leverage. They could walk away from the manor. They could name their wages. They could choose where to work and for whom. Many left their villages entirely, becoming free laborers who hired out their services to the highest bidder. Others moved to cities, fueling the rise of a new wage economy. The landowning elite, terrified of losing control, tried desperately to hold the old order together. In 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers, a law that made it illegal to ask for or pay more than pre-plague wages. It was a desperate attempt to freeze time, but time had already moved on. The law was widely ignored. It couldn't stop the tide. Local lords found themselves unable to enforce it. Entire estates collapsed without enough hands to maintain them. A serf who might have been beaten for leaving the manor a year earlier was now being offered a cottage and good coin to return. The balance of power was shifting, and the lords could feel it slipping from their fingers. This wasn't just about wages. It was about identity. For centuries, the very idea of class in England had been fixed, ordained by God and law. You were born to serve or born to rule, but now survivors of the plague were rising, not just economically, but spiritually. They saw themselves not as serfs, but as workers, free people who deserved to be paid for their labor. This new consciousness boiled over in 1381 in what would become known as the Peasants' Revolt. Thousands of laborers, artisans, and farmers marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and equality under the law. Their leader, Wat Tyler, spoke not with deference, but with defiance. To the horror of the nobility, King Richard II met with the rebels, even promising reforms, before brutally executing Tyler and crushing the uprising. But something had already changed. Though the revolt was put down, serfdom never recovered. Over the next century, it continued to decay, not because of royal mercy, but because the economic engine that once powered it had broken beyond repair. Lords began leasing their lands for rent instead of demanding service. The old feudal duties faded into contracts. Serfs became tenants. Legal bondage gave way to negotiation. By the early 1400s, the term serf had become nearly obsolete in England. The Black Death had achieved what no army or parliament could. It shattered the structure of medieval servitude, not out of compassion or ideology, but out of chaos and death. In trying to survive, the common people had found something greater than life. They had found freedom. This transformation did not come cleanly. Many lords resisted for decades. The crown clung to control through taxes and laws. But the seeds had been sown not by politics, but by pestilence. And from those seeds grew a new England, one in which labor had power, mobility had meaning, and the ancient chains of serfdom had rusted in the graveyards of the plague. It is tempting to see the Black Death only as horror. And in truth, it was horror. But history rarely gives us stories of pure tragedy or pure triumph. In the devastation, in the collapse of everything known, something unthinkable happened. The lowest in society, those once deemed voiceless, were given a choice. And they used it. Not all revolutions come by sword or vote. Some are born in silence, in the spaces left by the dead. The Black Death left such a space, a void so massive that no lord could fill it, no law could ignore it. The world that rose from that silence was not the same. It never could be. The plague had taken half the population, but it gave birth to a new class, the worker, and England would never be feudal again. The king who fled London in terror = sign. In the summer of 1348, a silent horror arrived on England's southern coast. It came not with the clash of armies or the thunder of war horses, but in silence, on the backs of rats, in the breath of strangers, and through the invisible sting of the air itself. By the time it reached London, it would forever scar the heart of a kingdom. This was the Black Death. King Edward III ruled England in an age of ambition, war, and chivalry. A powerful monarch and military leader, Edward had dreams of continental conquest and a throne in France. But no sword could stop what was coming. The plague, bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic, did not recognize crowns or castles. It whispered through alleyways and drifted through palace halls with the same ruthless intent. By the late summer of 1348, the first reports of death and disease had reached the royal court. At first it was distant, rumors from the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. But the news grew darker. Whole villages were falling silent. Corpses lay abandoned in homes. Priests refused to enter churches. The signs were unmistakable: swellings in the groin and armpits, high fevers, vomiting of blood, death within days. London, the bustling heart of Edward's kingdom, was soon under siege, not by foreign enemies, but by a foe no one could see. Rats thrived in the filth of the medieval city. Fleas carried the Yersinia pestis bacterium, and with every bite, another victim was claimed. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Bell towers no longer rang the hour, they told the dead. Funeral processions gave way to carts heaped with corpses, and grave diggers collapsed from exhaustion, their shovels still in hand. Edward's own household was not spared. Members of his court fell ill. Servants disappeared. The disease did not respect royal walls. The panic within Westminster spread like wildfire, as if the very air had turned against them. For a moment, the king, the supreme authority in the land, stood powerless. Then he fled. In the autumn of 1349, King Edward III abandoned London. The seat of English power, the city that crowned monarchs and minted gold, was left behind. The king rode out with his entourage, distancing himself from the rot, the wails, the stench of a dying city. He sought refuge in the countryside, where the plague moved slower and the air felt cleaner. But he did not simply retreat. He issued orders. Edward commanded that churches across England hold daily prayers. He ordered processions, fasts, and ceremonies of repentance. The plague, he believed, was divine punishment, a scourge sent by God for the sins of the world. And so, instead of doctors, he sent priests. Instead of medicine, he offered scripture. In towns and villages, people walked barefoot through the streets, flagellating themselves with whips, crying for forgiveness. But still, the death toll rose. The streets of London became a theater of despair. Eyewitnesses described a city where dogs fed on bodies and children wept beside their lifeless mothers. The cemeteries filled faster than graves could be dug. A new burial ground was established at Smithfield and later at Charterhouse. Even these overflowed. The Bishop of London consecrated an emergency cemetery in East Smithfield, where thousands were dumped in mass trenches, layer upon layer, of the dead covered with quicklime. The social order began to dissolve. With the nobles gone and the clergy dying, chaos reigned. Laborers refused to work, terrified of infection. Shops stood empty. The courts shut down. Trade vanished. The price of food soared. The price of life fell. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population perished within 18 months. London, once a proud capital, became a haunted grave. For King Edward, the terror was not just physical, it was existential. The plague struck at the very core of his divine right to rule. If a monarch could not protect his people, what did it mean to be king? Edward turned increasingly to faith, founding religious institutions in the wake of the pestilence. In 1349, he wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, urging more prayer, more repentance, and more sacrifices to appease God's wrath. But privately, he must have wondered whether any plea could stop death once it had set its course. When the plague's fury finally eased in 1350, London was changed forever. Streets were quieter. Guilds were shattered. Families were erased. Yet Edward returned, not to triumph, but to govern a kingdom reeling from loss. His later reign was marked by economic strife and the need to fill vacant lands, homes, and titles. Labor shortages led to the infamous Ordinance of Laborers, attempting to fix wages and bind workers to their jobs. It would fail, and the seeds of peasant rebellion were planted. The memory of the king who fled lived on. To some he had been wise, preserving the monarchy to rebuild the realm. To others he had abandoned them in their darkest hour. History does not judge monarchs gently. but perhaps it's unfair to ask courage from a man facing the unimaginable. The Black Death was not a war he could fight. It was a silence that moved faster than messengers, a rot that bloomed beneath the skin, a judgment that neither sword nor scepter could repel. In that silence, even a king could only run. And so he did. Yet his flight tells us something raw and real about power, how fragile it is when the veil is lifted, how beneath the golden crowns and velvet robes, rulers are just men, men who bleed, fear, grieve, and flee. In a time when no answers came from heaven and no comfort from kings, the people of London buried their dead, burned their clothes, and waited for the end. But still, somehow, they endured. The survivors of the plague built a new London atop the ashes of the old. Their resilience, not their monarch's retreat, carried England forward. The great wheel of history turned, slowly, grimly, unstoppably. And in its turning, it etched into stone the memory of a king who once turned his back on a dying city, and the people who stayed behind. When the River Thames ran black with death, they say the Thames has always been the lifeblood of London. But there was a time, not so long ago, when that lifeblood ran thick with death. In the summer of 1665, London was already a city under siege, not from armies or kings, but from something far smaller and infinitely more cruel. The Great Plague had returned. It began slowly, with whispers in the alleys and a few mysterious deaths in the poorer parishes. But soon there was no denying it. The Black Death was back. The city was unprepared. 2 decades of peace and prosperity had dulled its memory of the last epidemic. But when the hot winds of summer began to blow and the rats multiplied in the overflowing gutters, the disease began its terrible ascent. Yersinia pestis again, bubonic plague, a killer carried by fleas, riding on rats, infiltrating the walls of the city with a kind of ghostly patience. The rich fled first. Carriages rolled out through the city gates packed with nobles, doctors, and anyone with the means to escape. King Charles II and his court vanished into the countryside. But for the poor, for the laborers and washerwomen and orphan children left behind, there was nowhere to run. The death toll surged. Hundreds per week became thousands. Entire households were wiped out within days. Watchmen were assigned to guard infected homes, marking the doors with red crosses and the chilling words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." These houses were sealed shut. No one in, no one out. Gravediggers could not keep pace. The official plague pits overflowed. Night after night, carts rolled through the streets, collecting the bodies of the dead. The cries of "Bring out your dead" became part of the city's soundtrack. London, once vibrant, now moved to the rhythm of death. And when the pits filled, when there was no more room in the earth, people turned to the river. The Thames, dark and wide, had always served the city. It carried food, goods, even royal barges. But now it carried the dead. Desperate families, too poor to bribe the gravediggers or too afraid to wait for help, began wrapping their loved ones in cloth and pushing them into the water under the cover of night. Some were tied to rocks. Others floated downstream, bloated and white, catching on the piers and bridges. The riverbanks stank of rot. Fishermen stopped casting their nets. Watermen refused to row certain stretches. And beneath the surface, the Thames became a liquid graveyard. Sewage, refuse, and corpses churned together in the sluggish summer current. People spoke of the river turning black, not metaphorically but literally, thick with waste and decay. Londoners began to speak in hushed tones, not just of death but of judgment. Many believed this plague was divine punishment. Others blamed the poor, or foreigners, or the unlucky. But none could deny what was happening. The heart of the city had become a festering wound, and the Thames, once a source of life, had become its oozing vein. The official records tell us that over 68,000 people died during the Great Plague of 1665, but modern estimates suggest the real number was closer to 100,000, nearly a quarter of the city's population. And still, the river kept flowing, carrying away the dead, the secrets, the sins of a dying city. Then, as quickly as it came, the plague began to fade. By winter, the biting cold slowed the fleas. The rats died off. The fever of death lifted, leaving behind a city exhausted, broken, and afraid to speak of what it had seen. But London would not be allowed to rest for long. Just 1 year later, in 1666, fire would come. The Great Fire of London, sweeping through the same neighborhoods that had only just buried their dead. Some said the fire was divine mercy, cleansing the plague-stained streets. Others saw it as another punishment. But in truth, both plague and fire reshaped London forever. The narrow lanes were widened. The wooden houses were rebuilt in stone, and slowly life returned. But the Thames remembers. Today, tourists float along its waters in glassy boats, sipping coffee and snapping photos of the skyline. They glide over the same current that once carried bodies through the heart of a dying city. They don't see the shadows beneath. They don't hear the midnight splashes. But the stories remain. If you walk along the banks at night, when the fog rolls in and the city falls silent, you might feel it. The weight of history pressing against the still water. The memory of a time when London bled into its river and the Thames ran black with death. Because history is not always written in books or carved in stone, sometimes it's written in water, and sometimes the river doesn't forget. The plague doctor who vanished in the smoke. He appeared like a shadow at dusk, tall, draped in a black leather coat, his face hidden behind a beaked mask, eyes shielded by glass. He arrived in Bristol quietly, without name, without banner, only word of mouth trailing his steps. They called him a doctor, but he carried no papers, bore no emblem, and claimed no fee. He came only when the coughing started, and then he vanished. It was the year 1666. The Great Plague still choked the south of England. Though London had been the epicenter, the disease had begun to radiate outward, licking the countryside like fire through dry straw. In the harbor city of Bristol, unease hung thick in the air. Ships had slowed, commerce had faded, and people whispered of bad air, cursed winds, and divine wrath. That's when the doctor came. Locals couldn't remember who saw him first. He had no known lodging, no known assistant. But wherever plague broke out, he followed. Some said he moved from door to door at night, slipping into infected homes as others locked their windows and burned rosemary in fear. Others swore they saw him atop the hills at dawn, watching the fog roll in from the harbor. But there was something different about him. Traditional plague doctors of the time were more symbol than savior. Their leather coats and grotesque bird-like masks were meant to ward off miasma, the bad air they believed caused illness. Inside the beak, they stuffed herbs, rose petals, or camphor to cleanse the air. They rarely touched the sick. More often, they recorded deaths, lanced buboes, or offered last rites. But this stranger, was different. Witnesses said he actually treated the dying, that he washed wounds with vinegar, burned bedding, and carried strange glass tubes to test the air. He spoke little, but when he did, he warned people to stay indoors, to seal their homes tightly, to avoid gatherings. One survivor later recalled that the doctor said something chilling. "It rides the wind," he whispered. "It does not need rats." In an era where most still blamed fleas, rats, or divine punishment, this idea that the plague could be airborne was heresy. And yet, wherever his warnings were heeded, outbreaks slowed. Entire alleyways where he was seen working saw far fewer deaths than others. It was as if he knew, as if he understood the terrible truth. Centuries too early. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Some say he was seen walking into the smoke of a burning quarantine house. Others say he boarded a ship at midnight, with no crew and no lights. Some claimed he was a ghost, sent by God or the devil, or perhaps both. Others insisted he was a time traveler, a man from the future trying to save a doomed past. Of course, historians are quick to point out the lack of formal records. No name, no documentation, no official mention of such a figure in the city's archives. A myth, they say. A folk tale built from fear and hope. a phantom hero imagined by desperate survivors. But the testimonies persist. A diary from a merchant's widow mentions a strange masked doctor who visited her home and saved her son. A parish record lists fewer deaths in certain streets near the docks, where the doctor was rumored to be seen, and most intriguingly, a locked chest found in an abandoned cellar in Bristol in the late 19th century contained vials, herbs, and notes, written in Latin and French, detailing what seemed like early experiments on plague transmission. The chest was real, the handwriting unmatched, the contents never fully explained. One fragment of a note read, "It floats between us, invisible, patient, and unforgiving." Was he a real man, a lone visionary, a physician who grasped airborne contagion long before science caught up? Or was he a symbol, a masked figure onto whom survivors projected their need for order, reason, and compassion in a time of horror? Whatever the truth, his legacy lives on in the whispers of a dying city. A city that remembers not just the rats and the boils, but the man in black who walked among the sick without fear and vanished into smoke before anyone could ask who he really was. Today, we understand that the plague can spread through respiratory droplets, especially in its pneumonic form. But in 1666, such an idea was unthinkable. It would take over 200 years before germ theory gained ground, and even longer before public health began to align with scientific understanding. Yet someone, perhaps just one man, seemed to know, and he left behind only mystery. No statue stands in his honor, no grave marks his end. But in the misty corners of history between fact and folklore, his mask still lingers. And the question remains, what if he was right? What if someone, in the depths of the plague, glimpsed a truth far ahead of his time and gave everything to save those who would never know his name? The law that tried to freeze wages by force. It was the year 1349. England was not just grieving, it was unraveling. The Black Death had swept through the land with merciless speed. In less than 2 years, entire villages were emptied. Fields were left fallow, roads silent. Over half of England's population gone. But as the dead were buried, something strange began to happen among the living. The survivors, those few who had somehow escaped the plague, discovered something new. Their labor suddenly had value. Landowners, once arrogant and indifferent, were now desperate. They needed workers. Farms needed tending. Cities needed rebuilding. And for the first time in their lives, peasants were in a position to bargain. The poor began to ask for more wages, and more shockingly, they began to receive them. What followed was a moment of profound panic for the elite. The social order had always rested on one unspoken rule: the poor should never have leverage. But now they were demanding fair pay, walking away from their lords, choosing who they would work for. It was not just an economic shift. It was a psychological revolution. And so, the crown struck back. In June 1349, King Edward III issued a decree unlike anything seen before. It was called the Ordinance of Laborers, and it was meant to put the peasants back in their place. The law declared that no man was to ask for or be given more wages than he earned before the plague. In other words, it attempted to freeze the economy in time, to ignore death, loss, and desperation, and pretend that nothing had changed. If a laborer dared to demand more, he could be jailed. If an employer dared to pay more, he could be fined. All workers under 60 were required to work. And those who refused could be treated as criminals, vagrants, and vagabonds. The government wasn't just freezing wages. It was trying to freeze reality. But reality doesn't listen to laws. Across England, workers pushed back. Some fled to distant towns. Others refused to work entirely, knowing that the landowners couldn't replace them. Underground agreements were made, payments hidden in meals, clothes, favors. And slowly the law began to fracture. But the resentment did not fade. It deepened. Imagine being told that after surviving the worst disaster in history, your life had no added value, that your labor, suddenly vital, was to be shackled by law. that while the lords rebuilt their estates, you would be bound by chains of ink and parchment. The Ordinance of Laborers wasn't just a policy, it was a pressure cooker. And over time, the pressure became unbearable. This deep unrest wouldn't stay quiet. It would grow, ferment, and explode decades later in 1381 when the Peasants' Revolt swept across the country. Protesters stormed London, burned records, and demanded the end of serfdom. And one of their rallying cries? An end to forced labor and fixed wages, the very legacy of the 1349 Ordinance. The irony is almost poetic. A law written to preserve order had sown the seeds of revolution. And yet the Ordinance of Laborers was just the beginning. In 1351, it was solidified into a more powerful law, the Statute of Labourers. Parliament turned the temporary decree into a lasting tool of control, but none of it truly worked. Wages continued to rise in secret. Workers continued to choose where to go. The death of half a nation could not be erased by royal signature. The gap between law and life widened, and in that gap, the spirit of rebellion was born. In the grand sweep of history, 1349 is often remembered for the Black Death. But in the shadows of that plague, something else was dying. The illusion that the powerful could stop change with fear alone. The Ordinance of Laborers was a desperate attempt to hold back a tidal wave with a sword. But the wave had already broken, and it left behind not silence, but a question still echoing today. What happens when the hands that build a nation are no longer willing to be ruled by it? When Parliament met in a half-empty hall in the winter of 1349, the heart of English government beat weakly within the cold stone walls of Westminster. Parliament convened, but barely. Rows of benches, once filled with the voices of knights, lords, and bishops, now stood hauntingly empty. The Black Death had not spared them. One by one they had fallen, cut down not by sword or scandal, but by something they could neither debate nor legislate. Plague. By the time Parliament was called, England was already in collapse. Whole towns were silenced. Markets were abandoned. The King's writ, once unquestioned, was being ignored in manners where no one was left to read it. The realm needed leadership more than ever. But when the Lords and Commons assembled in 1349, fewer than ever arrived. They hadn't boycotted, they hadn't rebelled, they were simply dead. So many members of Parliament, especially among the clergy and gentry, had succumbed to the Black Death that reaching quorum became a near impossible task. The Parliament of January 1349 was one of the most sparsely attended in English history. Sessions that had once been raucous and crowded became quiet, somber affairs. There were no fiery speeches, no throngs of attendants, just a few shaken men trying to hold the kingdom together while death stalked their every step. Chroniclers of the time noted the surreal stillness of the assembly. Absent were the voices of familiar peers. Empty chairs marked not just vacancy, but mortality. Some seats were freshly unoccupied, left that morning when word of another death arrived. Others had remained untouched for weeks. No replacements could be found. No succession had yet been approved. The machinery of monarchy was sputtering. But they pressed on. They met in half-empty halls, in cold chambers, echoing with silence, because the alternative was collapse. Laws still needed to be passed. Taxes still needed to be levied. Troops needed to be paid. But how does a kingdom govern itself when its governors are gone? The survivors of Parliament were forced to make emergency decisions with barely enough men to hold debate. The Crown, sensing danger, issued writs and summonses to new men, many of them barely qualified, just to refill the seats. Entire power structures shifted as plague casualties opened unexpected vacancies. Nobles who had never dreamed of political influence found themselves elevated overnight. The old guard was vanishing, and with it, centuries of tradition. Even King Edward III, a monarch known for military ambition and firm control, was shaken. His court was fractured. His advisers were falling ill. Even his own daughter, Princess Joan, died of plague on the way to be married. And yet, government had to continue, no matter how few were left to run it. Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351 amid this instability, trying to freeze wages and bind workers to their pre-plague roles. But these laws were less about strength than desperation. The halls of government still echoed with loss. Each new session of Parliament brought fresh absences, men replaced not by rivals or reforms, but by mass graves. Yet there's a quiet defiance in this part of history. In a kingdom breaking under the weight of death, Parliament still sat. It still wrote laws. It still summoned voices, even if few were answered. Governance, even in its weakest hour, persisted. The rituals continued. The prayers were said. The clerk read the roll call, even as the silence grew longer after each name. And when laws were passed in those years, they bore the fingerprints of trauma. The kingdom's responses to labor shortages, taxation, land ownership, and legal reform all came from a parliament that had stared death in the face. They legislated through fear, through grief, through necessity. These weren't the proud sessions of old. These were survival sittings, desperate attempts to keep England breathing. Over time, Parliament recovered. New members came. New power dynamics emerged. But the plague had permanently changed the composition of English leadership. It accelerated merit over lineage, promoted loyalty over heritage, and forced rapid political adaptation. The once rigid hierarchy had been softened, burned by fire, yes, but tempered too. In the centuries that followed, the English Parliament would rise to become one of the most powerful legislative bodies in the world. But it is easy to forget that in 1349 it nearly faded into silence. It was only through the resolve of a handful of survivors, numbed by grief, shadowed by fear, that the institution endured at all. This is the image history leaves us: a grand hall, half empty, flickering torches, heavy robes on slumped shoulders, men reading speeches to no one, debating laws with ghosts. They ruled a kingdom of the dying, and kept it from dying itself. In the winter of 1349, the heart of English government beat weakly within the cold stone walls of Westminster. Parliament convened, but barely. Rows of benches, once filled with the voices of knights, lords, and bishops, now stood hauntingly empty. The Black Death had not spared them. One by one, they had fallen, cut down not by sword or scandal, but by something they could neither debate nor legislate: plague. By the time Parliament was called, England was already in collapse. Whole towns were silenced. Markets were abandoned. The King's writ, once unquestioned, was being ignored in manners where no one was left to read it. The realm needed leadership more than ever. But when the Lords and Commons assembled in 1349, fewer than ever arrived. They hadn't boycotted. They hadn't rebelled. They were simply dead. So many members of Parliament, especially among the clergy and gentry, had succumbed to the Black Death that reaching quorum became a near impossible task. The Parliament of January 1349 was one of the most sparsely attended in English history. Sessions that had once been raucous and crowded became quiet, somber affairs. There were no fiery speeches, no throngs of attendants, just a few shaken men trying to hold the kingdom together while death stalked their every step. Chroniclers of the time noted the surreal stillness of the assembly. Absent were the voices of familiar peers. Empty chairs marked not just vacancy, but mortality. Some seats were freshly unoccupied, left that morning when word of another death arrived. Others had remained untouched for weeks. No replacements could be found. No succession had yet been approved. The machinery of monarchy was sputtering. But they pressed on. They met in half-empty halls and cold chambers echoing with silence, because the alternative was collapse. Laws still needed to be passed. Taxes still needed to be levied. Troops needed to be paid. But how does a kingdom govern itself when its governors are gone? The survivors of Parliament were forced to make emergency decisions with barely enough men to hold debate. The Crown, sensing danger, issued writs and summonses to new men, many of them barely qualified, just to refill the seats. Entire power structures shifted as plague casualties opened unexpected vacancies. Nobles who had never dreamed of political influence found themselves elevated overnight. The old guard was vanishing, and with it, centuries of tradition. Even King Edward III, a monarch known for military ambition and firm control, was shaken. His court was fractured. His advisers were falling ill. Even his own daughter, Princess Joan, died of plague on the way to be married. And yet, government had to continue, no matter how few were left to run it. Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351 amid this instability, trying to freeze wages and bind workers to their pre-plague roles. But these laws were less about strength than desperation. The halls of government still echoed with loss. Each new session of Parliament brought fresh absences, men replaced not by rivals or reforms, but by mass graves. Yet there's a quiet defiance in this part of history. In a kingdom breaking under the weight of death, Parliament still sat. It still wrote laws. It still summoned voices, even if few were answered. Governance, even in its weakest hour, persisted. The rituals continued. The prayers were said. The clerk read the roll call, even as the silence grew longer after each name. And when laws were passed in those years, they bore the fingerprints of trauma. The kingdom's responses to labor shortages, taxation, land ownership, and legal reform all came from a parliament that had stared death in the face. They legislated through fear, through grief, through necessity. These weren't the proud sessions of old. These were survival sittings, desperate attempts to keep England breathing. Over time, Parliament recovered. New members came. New power dynamics emerged. But the plague had permanently changed the composition of English leadership. It accelerated merit over lineage, promoted loyalty over heritage, and forced rapid political adaptation. The once rigid hierarchy had been softened, burned by fire, yes, but tempered too. In the centuries that followed, the English Parliament would rise to become one of the most powerful legislative bodies in the world. But it is easy to forget that in 1349 it nearly faded into silence. It was only through the resolve of a handful of survivors, numbed by grief, shadowed by fear, that the institution endured at all. This is the image history leaves us: a grand hall, half empty, flickering torches, heavy robes on slumped shoulders, men reading speeches to no one, debating laws with ghosts. They ruled a kingdom to the mass grave that screamed at night, London, 1349, the year the city lost its breath. The Black Death had arrived in full force, drowning the capital in silence and stench. Streets were empty, shops shuttered, prayers hoarse. There was no laughter, no music, only the constant toll of church bells and the ever-present creak of death carts rolling across cobblestone. And at the edge of this dying city, a field once used for livestock was transformed into something else. East Smithfield. It became the city's final resting place, its mouth wide open, swallowing tens of thousands. This field, consecrated in desperate haste, became the center of London's last hope and deepest fear. Day and night carts arrived. Men with cloth over their faces tossed bodies like sacks. No time for ceremony, no time for names. But it wasn't just the dead who were buried. As the plague ravaged London with terrifying speed, the dead outnumbered the living. Gravediggers collapsed from exhaustion, priests refused last rites, and panic spread faster than infection. In the frenzy to clear homes and streets, many were mistaken for dead, feverish, barely breathing, unconscious from disease or shock. They were tossed into mass graves, still clinging to life. And soon the stories began. The gravediggers at East Smithfield, those hardened men who wielded shovels like soldiers wield swords, began to whisper. Not to others, but to themselves, to the night, to their own trembling hands. They swore they heard it, scratching beneath the soil, faint cries echoing up from the newly covered pits. Moans where no living man should be. At first the sounds were blamed on madness, hallucinations caused by exhaustion and trauma. After all, who could sleep surrounded by the wails of a dying city? But the reports continued. Some diggers quit their posts. Others returned drunk to dull their ears. And a few, those who stayed late at the pits, claimed they heard something that would never leave them. a scream that tore through the earth as if death itself was trying to claw its way back. Modern historians now believe the accounts weren't hysteria. They were horror, real and unfiltered. In the desperate rush to control the plague, there was no time to wait for signs of life, no careful checking of breath or pulse. In many cases, burial began before death had finished. Imagine the terror, waking in darkness, surrounded by corpses, lungs burning, screams muffled by soil, buried beneath strangers, beneath the weight of panic and haste. These weren't legends or ghost stories. These were human tragedies, sealed under layers of dirt and lime, and East Smithfield holds their silence. Today, we know from archaeological excavations that more than 17,000 bodies were buried in the East Smithfield plague pits in less than a year. The trenches were dug deep, 6 to 10 feet, filled layer upon layer, covered quickly with chalk and soil. The bodies were mostly wrapped in simple shrouds, no coffins, no markers. Families buried together or not at all. Children beside strangers. Lovers separated by inches of earth. But the real horror isn't just in the numbers. It's in the speed. In many pits, experts found layers of human remains with almost no sediment between them, indicating that thousands were dumped within days of each other. There simply wasn't time to mourn. And in that rush, the dying were entombed with the dead. Some remains even show signs of struggle. Twisted limbs, fingernails chipped, faces locked in expressions not of peace, but agony, as if they awoke too late, screaming into the soil, unheard by the living, unanswered by heaven. And the gravediggers? They remembered. Even years later, those who survived the plague wouldn't go near East Smithfield. Children were told not to play near it. Locals swore that on windless nights, when the city was quiet, you could still hear it, the muffled sobs of souls never properly laid to rest. What makes this tale so haunting is not the supernatural. It's the raw historical truth. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was a collapse of time, of custom, of dignity. And in that collapse, the line between life and death blurred. For those buried alive, the plague wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a much crueler death. And yet, we've paved over East Smithfield. Today, it's a sterile part of London's cityscape. Concrete and glass cover the bones of the forgotten. But if you dig deep, into the history, into the soil, you'll find them. Thousands who never screamed loud enough to be saved. Thousands who remind us that fear, ignorance, and desperation can bury more than bodies. It can bury conscience. So when you walk the streets of London, remember what lies beneath. Not just bones, but stories, unfinished, unspoken. The field that once screamed at night still holds its silence. But it waits. And those who listen closely, even now, swear they can still hear the dirt shift. Not ghosts, but memory. The memory of those who died unheard, and of a city that, for one terrifying moment, couldn't tell the difference between the dead and the dying. The bishop who ordered his own grave. Dug early, he was a man of God, but also a man of fear. Bishop Ralph of Shrewsbury was no ordinary clergyman. He held power, wealth, and influence. He presided over countless masses, negotiated with nobles, and watched as England's shifting winds of politics and plague swept through his diocese. Yet, despite all that earthly command, there was one thing he feared more than any rebellion, heresy, or sin: death. It wasn't uncommon in medieval times to be preoccupied with mortality. After all, life expectancy was short, disease was rampant, and war was never far away. But Bishop Ralph's obsession ran deeper. It wasn't just fear of death itself, it was fear of dying unprepared, fear of the unknown hour, fear of meeting his Maker without his soul in perfect order. So, in an act that unsettled even his fellow clergy, Bishop Ralph did something few had dared to do. He ordered his own grave to be carved while he was still alive. Not in secret, not quietly, but in full view of the world. In the sacred grounds of Wells Cathedral, where he served as bishop in the mid-14th century, stonecutters were summoned. Under Ralph's watchful eye, they chiseled a tomb, not for someone already gone, but for someone who still breathed. A sarcophagus of elaborate Gothic design, detailed with his name, his robes, and even his likeness carved into stone as though he were already lying in it. But the grave was not hidden. No, Ralph had it placed where all could see it. Each Sunday he would walk to the tomb, and there, beside his own sculpted deathbed, he would deliver sermons. Imagine the sight. A bishop preaching of sin, repentance, and eternal judgment, with his own carved body resting beside him in cold stone. A chilling reminder to the congregation and to himself of what lay ahead. Why would a man so devout do such a thing? Because in medieval theology, death was not an end, it was a trial. A moment where the soul stood before God, stripped of wealth, status, or robes of office. And for Ralph, preparation for that moment was not symbolic. It had to be literal. He believed that meditating beside his future grave would keep him humble, that standing before his own death each week would strip away ego, vanity, and distraction. His sermons grew darker, more urgent. He preached not of kings or wars, but of the worm, the rot, the soul's peril. Some whispered that he was consumed by it, that he had stared too long into the pit. But Ralph didn't care. He paid for the tomb's completion with his own funds, sparing no expense. And as the Black Death began creeping across Europe, nearing England's shores, the urgency in his eyes deepened. He saw what others denied. The invisible tide was rising. While others clung to superstition and denial, Ralph stood before his tomb like a prophet, warning of the darkness. His grave became not just a monument, but a stage, a pulpit of mortality. And when the plague finally reached England in 1348, Bishop Ralph was ready. He did not flee like other nobles, he remained. He tended to the dying. He performed last rites over and over again, breathing in the same air as the infected, knowing it would find him too. It is said that when his time finally came, he climbed into his tomb on his own feet, that he passed not with fear, but with resolve, that he died as he lived, in the shadow of death, fully aware, fully prepared. His tomb remains in Wells Cathedral to this day. A limestone effigy lying in peaceful repose, hands folded in prayer, face serene. Visitors walk past it every day, unaware of the man who once stood above it, alive, preaching to the living as if he were already dead. The world remembers tyrants, heroes, kings, but it often forgets those whose battle was fought in silence, in the mind, against fear itself. Bishop Ralph of Shrewsbury left behind more than a stone tomb. He left behind a message. That death is not to be ignored or romanticized, but faced, daily, directly, even beside your own grave. Because when you know where you're going to lie, maybe you live differently. Maybe you speak differently. Maybe, like Ralph, you stop pretending that you'll have time later to be ready. He didn't wait. And in doing so, he became a monument not just of stone, but of what it means to truly prepare for the end. When cats and dogs were blamed and slaughtered, it began with fear, the kind that swells in silence, multiplies in whispers, and explodes in the scent of death. The year was 1665. The Great Plague was swallowing London. Day by day the city darkened, not just from death, but from the decisions it drove desperate people to make. When doctors failed, when prayers fell silent, and when no cure could stop the dying, the people turned to blame. But this time, the accused were not witches, not heretics, not even foreigners. No. This time, the accused had fur, they had 4 legs, and they lived in homes, curled by fireplaces, perched on windowsills, cats and dogs. In the frenzy of pestilence, logic dissolved. Superstition filled the void. The death toll was climbing. People were coughing blood, their bodies swelling with buboes, their skin blackening. They didn't understand what was causing it. But they noticed something. Animals were always nearby. Pets wandered the streets. Dogs barked endlessly. Cats leapt over walls, and suddenly it clicked. In the minds of frightened men and terrified councils, these creatures must be spreading the disease. And so began one of the most tragic and ironic massacres in the history of public health. City orders were issued. Cats and dogs, especially strays, were to be culled immediately. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. In London alone, an estimated 40,000 dogs and over 200,000 cats were killed, sometimes beaten in the streets, sometimes drowned in the Thames, sometimes simply disappeared from their homes, never to return. But in trying to stop the plague, they unleashed it. You see, cats and dogs weren't the carriers. They were the hunters, the predators, the ones keeping the real culprits in check. Because hidden in the walls, beneath the floorboards, and behind the food stores, the rats were watching. And more importantly, so were the fleas on their backs. It was those fleas, carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the bubonic plague, that bit, infected, and killed. And now, with the natural enemies of rats gone, the vermin multiplied, unchecked, unchallenged, and so did the death. The city didn't realize what it had done. The more animals they killed, the more plague they faced. It was a brutal, self-feeding cycle of death and mistake. Some doctors tried to protest. A few noted that in homes where cats were spared, rats were fewer. But reason had no power in the face of fear. The culling continued. This wasn't the first time such a thing happened. During earlier outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century, similar patterns emerged. People misunderstood disease. They saw only symptoms, not sources. And in the chaos, the animals paid the price. Yet, the consequences were far more than ecological. They were symbolic. Because to many, especially the poor, cats and dogs were not just animals. They were companions. In cramped houses, in dark tenements, a small dog was comfort. A cat was warmth. To rip them away was to rip away hope. But the authorities didn't care. To them, it was prevention. To the people, it was grief on top of grief. Even more disturbing were the methods. Children were paid to drown litters of puppies. Stray animals were trapped and burned. Packs of boys roamed the alleys with blunt weapons, encouraged to cull as many animals as they could. It became a ritual of sorts. A cleansing of the city, one paw print at a time. And while they killed cats, the rats multiplied in the walls. Today, we know how misguided it was. Cats are among nature's most effective rat hunters. Even their scent deters rodents. Dogs, especially certain breeds, are born ratters. But back then, science had not caught up. Germ theory was still centuries away. Disease was seen as divine punishment or carried through miasma, bad air. So anything unusual, anything present during illness, became a suspect. And in that net of superstition, animals were easy targets. What's most haunting, though, is how silent history is about this. We speak of the plague, of the deaths, of the doctors in their bird-like masks, but rarely of the animals. Rarely of the innocent creatures whose lives were taken by mistake, whose absence may have cost more lives than their presence ever could. There are no monuments for them, no footnotes in school books, just occasional lines in old council records referencing the suppression of dogs and cats, as if they were a nuisance, not a tragedy. But the lesson remains. In times of crisis, when fear takes the wheel, truth becomes its first casualty. And history shows us again and again. The scapegoat may bleed, but it never stops the storm. Only understanding can do that. Only patience and knowledge and compassion. So the next time the world trembles in fear of an invisible enemy, remember what happened when we let panic dictate policy. Remember the cats who never returned, the dogs who never barked again. Remember the unseen cost of blind reaction. Because in 1665, we didn't just fail the animals, we failed ourselves. The mass wedding held in a graveyard. They gathered in the shadow of death, dressed not in joy, but in fear. It was 1349 in York, and the plague had made its way north. The air was thick with dread. Each morning brought more carts piled with corpses. Entire families vanished between dawn and dusk. The bells tolled constantly, until even the bell ringers died. People had prayed, fasted, flagellated themselves in public. Nothing stopped the Black Death. And so, in desperation, a new ritual emerged, one so strange, so tragic, it would be remembered in whispers for centuries. A mass wedding held in a graveyard. Dozens of young couples were brought together to marry in the presence of death itself. The idea, it was said, came from a priest who claimed a vision. that God would see their union among the dead as an act of ultimate faith, that love in the face of death would sanctify the land, that perhaps, just perhaps, a divine blessing could halt the plague. They believed him, because they had to believe in something. The graveyard was fresh with open pits. Mass burials took place daily. The soil was red, churned, broken. And there, among the crosses and the stench of decay, the couples were wed, one after another. Some were already sick. Some cried. Some whispered prayers as the priest's voice cracked through incense and ash. Families stood nearby, not in celebration, but in silence. Some believed the ritual might work. Others watched in disbelief. How could anyone invite joy here, in the belly of mourning? But the couples held hands. They said their vows. And when the final amen echoed off the church walls, the wind carried it across the graves like a final plea. It didn't work. Within weeks, almost every one of those newlyweds was dead. Some never even made it to their wedding night. Others died within days of embracing. It was as if the plague had been waiting for them, drawn to their hope like a flame to wax. The priest who led the ceremony succumbed shortly after. His last known words were said to be a prayer for forgiveness. But what drove them to marry in such a place? What madness or courage fueled that decision? In truth, it wasn't madness. It was hope weaponized by despair. You must understand the time. The church was everything. Heaven and hell weren't metaphors. They were facts. People believed that sin brought plague, that divine mercy could alter fate. And in a world where medicine had failed, where the healthy dropped dead mid-sentence, faith was the only tool left. Some historians suggest the ritual may have also served a social function. The marriage rites ensured inheritance, property transfer, and the hope of legitimate heirs, if any survived. But these were thin rationalizations. The truth was simpler. People wanted to be joined before death took them. They wanted to mean something to someone before they were buried in a nameless pit. To marry in a graveyard was both defiance and surrender. It said, "I will not wait for the end to come quietly. I will make meaning where I can." And yet it also acknowledged the truth. The dead were already among them. In York, the site of that graveyard remains a mystery now, lost under centuries of new stone and soil. No monument marks the spot. No plaque, only parish records, fragments of letters, and the oral history of a town that once tried to outpray death. It didn't work, but it happened. And in that, there's something unforgettable. Because the story of the mass wedding in the graveyard isn't just a tale of superstition or failed ritual. It's a story about what it means to be human in the face of extinction. To love, even then. To believe, even then. To cling to one another while the world fell apart. And though their names are lost and their vows are dust, something of their courage remains, echoing in every choice we make to love despite the odds. That day, death watched the living say, "I do," and still took them. The plague pits under modern London streets, beneath the polished marble floors of train stations, beneath the coffee shops, the concrete, the neon lights, and the roaring underground. There is silence, but not empty silence. It is the silence of the dead, hundreds of thousands of them, buried in haste, without coffins, without names. London walks on plague pits. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, the city was unprepared. At first, they tried to keep up with the burials. Graveyards overflowed. Churchyards ran out of space. And then came the fear. Death was moving too fast. Whole households wiped out. Carters pushing bodies by the dozens through cobbled streets. There was no time for ceremony, no time for prayer. Only one answer remained: mass graves. They called them plague pits. Vast open trenches, sometimes stretching over 100 feet long, dug into the earth with desperate urgency. Bodies were piled in like firewood, layer after layer of the dead, with quicklime tossed between them to slow the rot. The pits were sealed, covered, and forgotten. Or so they thought. Fast forward centuries later, modern London, expanding, tunneling, digging foundations for rail lines and skyscrapers. And then bones. In 1986, while expanding the Royal Mint site, workers unearthed a pit containing over 700 skeletons, stacked tightly, arms crossed or contorted, teeth gritted in death. Later, during construction of the Crossrail project, London's massive underground transit expansion, archaeologists struck another. Just meters below the bustling Farringdon station, they found 25 skeletons in neat rows. But this was only the surface. Analysis showed they were victims of the 1348-1350. Black Death and more, some belonged to the second wave of plague in the 14th century. Isotope testing revealed the horror behind the statistics. Malnourished children, young women, elderly men, none spared. Some skeletons had signs of infections. Others had coins still in their pockets. They died fast, with barely time to clutch the things they carried. Archaeologists estimate that tens of thousands were buried this way in plague pits across London. Some are beneath parks, like Charterhouse Square. Others lie beneath streets, shopping centers, and offices. In Aldgate in Smithfield, in East Smithfield, near the Tower of London, beneath commuters' feet, there is a city of bones. And yet, most Londoners have no idea. Every time someone walks across Moorgate or stands waiting for a train at Liverpool Street Station, they are within meters of medieval mass death. They pass over layers of history too deep for memory and too grim for memorials. No plaques mark these places, no signs. The living rarely want to be reminded, but the ground remembers. What makes these pits even more haunting is not just their scale, but their silence in the historical record. Most were unmarked. Few maps note them. There was no time to catalog death. Even the clergy fled. Only in rare chronicles do we find brief mentions of pits dug from sunrise to nightfall, or priests who died trying to bless them. Today, archaeologists work slowly, carefully, documenting each bone, each burial. Some are reburied with ceremony. Others are sent for study to learn how the plague worked, how it spread, how it killed. From the DNA preserved in their teeth, scientists have extracted the Yersinia pestis genome, the very bacteria that brought Europe to its knees. From those silent mouths, the plague speaks again. And there's something unsettling about that. We often think of medieval tragedy as distant, locked behind centuries of dust. But in London, the past is underfoot. There is no buffer. There is no safe historical distance. Every steel beam driven into the soil risks striking a grave. The question then becomes, how many more remain? Most plague pits are undocumented. Historians estimate there could be hundreds beneath London alone. Some may never be found. Others may be discovered by accident during future construction, street repair, or flood control work. Each new finding is a grim reminder. The city is built on catastrophe. And in a way, that's what gives London its strange resilience. It has been through collapse. It has walked hand in hand with death. And yet, above those pits, life continued. Cities rose, trains ran, lights turned on, coffee brewed. But deep below, in the cold layers of earth, they wait. Not to haunt, not to return, but to remind, to testify. Because the bones don't lie, they tell the truth of a world that broke, and of the people who kept building anyway. So the next time you walk through a London street, or sit on a bench in a quiet park, or ride the escalator down into the underground, ask yourself, who lies beneath? You may be closer than you think. The university that closed for 18 months. In the year 1349, silence fell over Cambridge. Not the hush of a library or the stillness of dawn, but a silence born of fear, of fleeing footsteps, of doors slammed shut forever. The university, a proud beacon of learning in medieval England, went dark. For the first time in its existence, its courts emptied. Its lectures stopped. Its halls stood cold and abandoned, because death had arrived. The Black Death didn't discriminate between farmer and noble, merchant or monk, and it certainly had no mercy for scholars. When the plague swept through England, it struck with terrifying precision. From London to the countryside, no place was safe. And when it reached Cambridge, A town of cramped wooden buildings, narrow alleys, and shared dormitories, it found a perfect breeding ground. At the time, Cambridge University was still young, barely over a century old. Yet, even then, it had become a symbol of England's rising intellectual ambition. Its colleges were filled with young minds, clerks, theologians, future lawyers, and priests. Men who studied Latin by candlelight, who debated Aristotle in cloisters, who imagined futures of scholarship, service, and science. But the plague had other plans. One by one, students vanished. At first, they simply stopped attending lectures. Then rumors spread. Someone had collapsed in the street. Another was found dead in his chamber. Soon, bodies were being carted out of colleges under cover of night. Scholars, tutors, porters, all fell victim. Some fled, hoping to outrun the breath of death. Others stayed, convinced their faith or logic would shield them. But reason held no power over pestilence. By the spring of 1349, Cambridge had ceased to function. For nearly 18 months, the university shut its gates. No lessons, no disputations, no new admissions. The town itself became a place of mourning, its economy collapsing with the absence of its students. Inns emptied, bakeries closed. The bells that once rang for chapel now tolled for the dead. And in the silence, a generation vanished. Historians now call them the lost minds of England. Talented scholars, many unnamed, some known only from fragments of college records, disappeared during this period. Some died in their beds, others never returned after fleeing to the countryside. They left behind half-written treatises, unanswered questions, and classrooms that would sit unused for over a year. The intellectual damage was profound. In some colleges, entire faculties had to be rebuilt. Whole lines of philosophical argument, legal study, and theological debate were broken. Manuscripts went unfinished. Promising careers ended before they began. And when the university finally reopened its doors in late 1350, it did so not in triumph, but in mourning. Records from the time are sparse, but what survives is haunting. One college listed no graduates for 3 years. Another held a memorial mass for over 40 fellows who never returned. Some students left behind letters, brief, frightened notes scrawled to family members describing the horror of classmates dying in their sleep, of professors collapsing mid-lecture. It wasn't just academic loss. The university was a training ground for the kingdom's clergy, legal officials, and administrators. The ripple effect of that 18-month closure spread far beyond the walls of Cambridge. Churches lacked trained priests. Courts lacked educated scribes. Parliament lost future clerks. In a kingdom already reeling from death, the absence of these thinkers left a void in governance, faith, and justice. Even after reopening, Cambridge was not the same. Enrollment numbers dropped. Many who returned were deeply changed, wary, hollow-eyed, and grieving. Others came from distant towns, inheriting positions meant for men now buried. A sense of disruption lingered. The plague had not just paused learning, it had fractured time. Before the plague, the university had been growing, its halls buzzing with ambition. Afterward, it limped back to life, aged by fear. Yet something else happened too. In the wake of death, a quiet resilience took root. New ideas emerged about medicine, mortality, faith, and human suffering. Survivors began to question old texts, not just revere them. They debated not only theology, but the nature of life itself. It was slow, uneven, but it was the beginning of a transformation in thought that would, centuries later, lead to revolutions in science and reason. Still, that does not undo the loss. The 18 months that Cambridge stood silent were not just a gap in a timeline. They were a wound, one that changed the university and the country it served. A reminder that knowledge can be fragile, and that even the greatest minds are not immune to history's darkest shadows. So the next time you walk through the ancient courtyards of Cambridge, through King's Parade, or under the archways of Clare College, listen to the silence that still lingers between the stones. It is the echo of a time when the pursuit of knowledge was drowned out by fear, when ink dried mid-sentence, when a generation's voices were lost beneath the toll of a funeral bell, and when the world learned, in the cruelest way, that even the brightest minds can be extinguished in a single breath. The ghost markets of Winchester, they called it a city of saints. A jewel in the English crown, Winchester, once the capital of Anglo-Saxon England, was a place of grandeur, tradition, and trade. Markets flourished beneath its cathedral spires. Merchants shouted their wares from timber-framed stalls. The air once smelled of spices, bread, and livestock. It was a city alive with purpose. But there was a moment in its history, a sharp and sudden break, when all of that vanished, almost overnight. The year was 1348. The same cursed year, the Black Death made landfall in Dorset. As the plague advanced, it crawled inland, following roads, carts, and footsteps. And Winchester, with its bustling trade routes and large population, was a prime target. At first, the market stayed open. People gathered as usual, laughing, haggling, buying meat, candles, bolts of cloth. Rumors of the sickness were dismissed. But then the dying began, fast, furious. Bodies collapsed between stalls. Buyers dropped dead, clutching coins. Vendors vanished mid-trade. The familiar buzz of the market grew fainter with each passing hour, replaced by silence, interrupted only by coughing, crying, and the tolling of bells. When the Black Death hit Winchester, it didn't nibble at the edges. It sank its teeth into the heart. Entire families were wiped out within days. Priests stopped counting the dead. And the markets, the beating heart of the town's economy and social life, were the first to go cold. People fled their stalls mid-sale, leaving behind coins, scales, and food half-weighed. Barrels of salted fish split open in the sun. Apples rotted where they were piled. Loaves of bread crumbled into dust on wooden carts. Livestock wandered loose, untended, and confused. The market squares, once so full of color and shouting, became ghostly arenas of decay. It was as though the town had simply been emptied by some unseen hand. Curtains remained tied open. Doors swung on broken hinges. Market awnings flapped in the wind. But the people were gone, and no one dared to return. The rotting food drew in animals. First the rats, bold and fat from the bodies. Then wild dogs. Then wolves from the forest's edge, creeping into town under cover of night. There are accounts, half legend, half memory, of wolves wandering through Winchester's cathedral grounds, sniffing the air, unafraid. Of pigs rooting through the abandoned bread stalls. Of horses running loose in circles, waiting for masters who would never come. The town square became a place of whispers. Even those who survived the plague were afraid to go back. Superstition took over. People believed the market was cursed, that the spirits of the dead still roamed the cobbles where they had taken their final breath. Merchants who returned too soon were said to fall ill again. The once vibrant heart of Winchester was now something else entirely, a symbol of how quickly civilization could crumble. It wasn't just Winchester. Across England, similar stories emerged. Markets that once served thousands became desolate. But Winchester's fall stood out because of its former prominence. This was no sleepy hamlet. It had once been England's capital, a place of royalty, saints, and pilgrimage. And now it lay hollowed out, its riches worthless, its bread uneaten. When the plague finally passed and survivors began to crawl back from their hiding places in the countryside, they found a town changed. The market square was unrecognizable. Wood had warped. Stalls had collapsed. The stone was stained with old blood and ash. The smell lingered for weeks. The animals were gone, but their claw marks remained. Slowly the people returned. Trade resumed cautiously. New stalls were built, but fewer. Many families had no sons left to sell goods. Many apprentices were now buried in plague pits. The marketplace that rose from the ashes was not the same. It never would be. To walk through Winchester today is to stroll over layers of history. Tourists snap photos of the charming streets, the cathedral, the cobbled markets. They don't hear what once echoed there. They don't see the ghost stalls or the rats or the wolves. But if you listen closely, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city is still, you might just feel it. That empty hush, that absence, the memory of a market that once teemed with life and was silenced in a matter of days. Because when death comes swiftly, it doesn't just take lives. It takes the laughter, the shouting, the smells, the rhythms. It leaves behind echoes, silent stalls, rotting apples, and stories like this, passed down like whispers through time. The ghost markets of Winchester are gone, but the silence they left behind still lingers. And some say that in the misty mornings when fog curls low over the stones, you can still see the outlines of the stalls and the faint shadows of those who never made it home. The abandoned castle. Where time froze, it stands in silence now, just ivy-cloaked ruins and crumbling stone walls open to the sky. But once Wigmore Castle pulsed with life. Laughter echoed through its great hall, firelight danced on ancient tapestries, and tables groaned beneath platters of roasted meat. Then, without warning, all of it stopped. Not over months, not even over weeks, but in a single haunting breath. What happened at Wigmore Castle is one of the most unsettling footnotes in English history. Not because of what was found, but because of what was left behind. The story begins in the 17th century during one of the darkest chapters in England's past. Civil War. Brother fought brother. Parliament clashed with Crown. Whole families were divided by loyalty, and violence rolled across the countryside like thunder. But in the borderlands between England and Wales, in the thick remote woodlands of Herefordshire, Wigmore Castle stood apart, imposing, ancient, and seemingly untouchable. Built in the 11th century by the de Mortimer family, it had weathered centuries of invasion, rebellion, and betrayal. It had outlived kings. But when the plague came, death didn't knock. It slipped in through the cracks, silent and unseen. The records are sparse, lost in the chaos of war and disease. But what we know is chilling. One day, neighbors came to the castle and found its gates wide open. No guards at the post, no servants to greet them, no sounds from the kitchens or stables. Just wind. Inside, they found the tables still set. Plates of food rotted in place. Fires, once roaring in the hearths, had burned down to embers, long, cold. Chairs were toppled as if people had fled mid-meal or collapsed in place. And there were no screams, no signs of battle, no looting. Just absence. An eerie kind of pause, as though someone had reached into the flow of time and pressed stop. Wigmore Castle had become a mausoleum, not one filled with bones, but with unanswered questions. What could cause an entire household to die so suddenly that not even a fire was stoked or a meal cleared? Some say it was the plague, not the long, wasting death of a slow illness, but its pneumonic form, which could kill in hours. If the infection struck during a shared gathering, like a feast or a council, it could have felled everyone in a single evening. One cough, one breath, then silence. Others whispered darker theories. That something was poisoned. That betrayal from within the castle walls sealed its fate. That a member of the household, desperate or mad, decided no one would leave. But no records tell us. No investigation followed. England was burning, and one dead castle was just another shadow in the firelight. After that day, Wigmore was never truly inhabited again. Its stone towers began to crumble. Its great hall was overtaken by roots. Nature crept in, slowly reclaiming what death had vacated. But the strangest thing of all was how little was taken. Looters never swarmed the place. Perhaps it was fear of the plague, of ghosts, or of something older. Perhaps they believed the castle was cursed, that time had frozen there for a reason. To this day, some locals swear it's a place where clocks feel wrong, where your footsteps echo too loudly, where animals grow nervous and refuse to pass. It became the kind of ruin that doesn't just fall into history, but slips into legend. And yet Wigmore Castle was once central to England's power. The Mortimers, its lords, were among the most influential families in the realm. One of them, Roger Mortimer, deposed a king. Another nearly claimed the throne. But now their legacy is a hollow shell and a haunting story. There's something profoundly disturbing about a place where time seems to have stopped mid-motion, where meals decayed untouched, where warmth drained from the walls, not with age, but with sudden, total abandonment. It's as if the castle itself remembers, as if it still waits for someone to return and finish the meal, stoke the fire, laugh again in the hall. But no one does. Today, Wigmore is a ruin you can still visit. If you're brave enough to hike through the thick woods, you'll find its remains half buried in moss. Its once mighty towers now barely scrape the sky. There are no guards, no barriers, no tour guides. Just silence, and stone, and questions. No bones were ever recovered. No definitive cause of death ever recorded. Only the echo of a moment when something terrible swept through a place of power and turned it into a graveyard disguised as a home. In the end, Wigmore Castle teaches us not just about death, but about the shape that death can take when it moves too fast for history to keep up. When life ends so abruptly that it leaves its objects behind like ghosts, bowls on tables, ashes in hearths, doors hanging open to a world that no longer knows who once lived inside. So, if you ever visit and feel like you're being watched, if the hairs rise on your neck when you cross the threshold, remember, it's not the dead you should fear, it's the silence. The kind of silence that only follows something sudden, something complete, something that ends not just people, but time itself. The graveyard shift that no one survived. They were the last people the dead would ever see. In the plague-ravaged countryside of East Anglia, 1349, a team of men was summoned to take on a task that no one wanted. Their job was simple in theory. At sunrise, they were to dig graves. At dusk, they were to fill them. Dozens of bodies a day, no ceremony, no delay. It was the height of the Black Death, and death itself was a constant presence, thick in the air, seeping through walls, settling into every breath like dust. Entire villages had already vanished, and those left behind needed someone, anyone, to bury the mounting dead. The group assigned that night wasn't made of trained priests or officials. They were gravediggers by necessity. Some were prisoners, offered freedom in exchange for labor. Others were desperate townsfolk hoping to earn a few coins or a loaf of bread. No one expected them to survive long, but no one expected them to all die at once. That night, under the dull orange haze of a plague-ridden sky, the team began their work. Shovels scraped against cold earth. Bodies wrapped in linens, if wrapped at all, were dragged into trenches. Some were children, some were barely dead. There were no rites, no crosses, just numbers. Villagers stayed far away, watching only from windows if they dared watch at all. It was said you could hear the men muttering prayers with everybody dropped, as if begging not to be next. And then morning came, and not a single man moved. The townspeople, hesitant but curious, approached the graveyard at dawn. What they found was a scene so chilling it became local legend. Every member of the grave team lay dead exactly where they had worked the night before. Some collapsed in mid-motion, still bent over open graves. Others lay flat in the trenches. A few sat slumped against the wheelbarrow, their hands still gripping the handles. Their shovels were still clenched in cold fists. No sign of violence, no wounds, just death, swift, silent, absolute. What happened? The answer, of course, is the plague. Modern historians believe the team may have been infected mid-task, exposed to the blackened sores or coughing breath of corpses who had died mere hours earlier, still contagious. Or perhaps one among the group was already infected, hiding it, hoping for one last wage before the fever took hold. But plague didn't always wait. In some cases, the disease could kill within hours, especially if a person had been weakened by hunger, cold, or exhaustion. And that night was long. The work was heavy. The air, filled with rot and flies, carried not just disease, but despair. And then there's the psychological toll. What does it do to a man to bury his neighbors, friends, and children in one endless shift? One chronicler wrote that death seemed to hunt in silence that year in East Anglia. that it stalked not just the weak, but the brave. And those grave-diggers, though desperate, were brave. They had touched what no one dared, moved what no one else would, and in doing so, sealed their fate. The town was so shaken by the sight that no one would enter the graveyard again for weeks. Bodies piled up in homes, on roads, in alleyways. Some people buried their own dead in backyards. Others fled entirely. A local priest recorded that even the angels have turned their eyes from this place. The dead men were eventually buried in the same mass trench they had dug. No markers, no names. Just another line of the anonymous dead in a year when even memory struggled to survive. But the story remained, passed down in whispers. The graveyard shift where no one made it home. The night when death, impatient, took the living before they had even finished burying the dead. Today, East Anglia is peaceful. Rolling fields, church towers, and cobblestone towns. But beneath some of that earth lie layers of history never unearthed. No plaques mark where those men fell. No grave bears their names. Yet they were there. And if you ever find yourself walking through one of East Anglia's ancient cemeteries at dusk, you might still feel it, the heaviness in the air, the lingering silence of unfinished prayers. Because some graves were dug by hands that never let go of the shovel. The secret letter that warned of total collapse. It was folded carefully. The ink faded with time, but the words still cut like a knife. A letter sent not by royalty nor by priest, but by a merchant. A man whose trade was cloth and silver, not prophecy. Yet in this letter, written in the year 1349, he spoke of the end of everything. "Death is now the only trade," he wrote, "and I cannot say how long the living will bother to buy." It was meant for a cousin living in Bruges, a warning, a whisper across the sea from a city being swallowed. He had watched London unravel, and now he feared the contagion would follow the trade routes that once brought wealth and silk. We do not know the merchant's name, but we know his fear. He described the streets in agony, dead carts rolling slowly through alleys piled with the swollen and the stiff. He wrote of dogs tearing at limbs, of priests who had buried 100 souls by noon and were dead by dusk. He begged his cousin not to come, not to send ships, not even to write back, unless the letter was burned after reading. "God has left the city," he wrote, or perhaps he never came. Letters like these were rare. Most people who lived through the plague could barely find time to bury their families, let alone write. But merchants had parchment, they had ink, and they had something else, perspective. They saw the flow of goods, of people, of money, and now of death. They understood collapse before it finished collapsing. The letter, now preserved in a London archive, was discovered centuries later in a merchant's chest, buried beneath floorboards. It had survived fire, flood, and forgetfulness. When scholars read it, they were struck by its clarity. This was not poetry. This was panic wrapped in cold logic. He spoke of entire warehouses converted to morgues, of laborers who refused coin, saying there was nothing left to buy, of children wandering the streets, crying out for mothers who lay silent. He called the Thames a river of sorrow where corpses sometimes floated out on the tide. He tried to keep accounts, briefly. But then, one by one, his clerks died. His apprentices fled. His servants locked the doors from the outside and never returned. The marketplace he had once loved had become a ghost square. And so, in a last act of clarity, he picked up a quill and began to write. Not for commerce, not for salvation, but for memory. In the letter, he speaks of a terrifying transformation. The city he knew, the city of bells and bargains and spice from the east, had vanished. In its place was a theater of rot. Every man now moved alone. Every woman carried silence like a veil. He said the only busy hands were those digging holes and those robbing the dead. And yet, within the horror, there is a moment of stillness. He writes of standing in the center of Cheapside one morning. The fog was thick. The bells had stopped ringing. For a moment, the entire city was silent. He could hear his own breath. He said it felt like London had paused between life and death, waiting to see which would win. He ends the letter without hope, not because he had lost faith, but because he saw clearly. "When the living are too few to carry the dead," he wrote, "we shall become a memory no one survives to speak." And then the letter stops. No signature, no farewell, just a blot of ink at the corner, as if the hand had fallen still. What makes this letter so haunting is not just its content, but its truth. Historians corroborate the details with parish records, burial counts, and merchant logs. London in 1349 was not simply sick, it was unraveling. And this man saw it not as a poet, but as a witness. His words are not dramatic, they are exact. Death is now the only trade. Today, that letter rests behind glass, protected from light and time. Tourists walk past it, barely glancing. But for those who read it closely, it becomes something more than ink on parchment. It becomes a voice clear across centuries, calling out from the moment when a city stood on the edge of oblivion. And perhaps what's most chilling is how familiar it feels. The way panic spreads faster than plague. The way trust collapses. The way people stop singing, stop speaking, stop believing the worst is over. This was not just one man's warning. It was London's confession. How the Black Death changed English forever. When the Black Death swept through England in 1348, it did more than empty villages and fill graveyards. It changed the very language people spoke. Before the plague, English was a peasant's tongue, spoken in kitchens, fields, and taverns, but rarely written. The language of power was Latin. The language of law was French. In courtrooms, scrolls, and sermons, English was largely absent. If you wanted to be taken seriously, in government, in church, in education, you wrote and spoke in Latin or Anglo-Norman French. But when the plague came, it silenced those voices. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that up to half of England's population was wiped out in under 2 years. And it wasn't just the poor. The plague struck monks, scribes, priests, and bureaucrats, those educated in Latin and fluent in the tongue of the elite. Whole monasteries were emptied. Legal clerks fell in droves. Teachers collapsed mid-lecture. The Black Death didn't just kill, it disrupted systems. Suddenly, there were fewer people who could read or write Latin, fewer scribes to copy laws, fewer priests to deliver sermons in learned tongues. The hierarchy of language began to crumble, not by rebellion, but by sheer loss. And in the vacuum, English rose. At first, it was out of necessity. Courts needed to function, contracts needed to be written, sermons still had to be preached. But with so many of the educated dead, English, spoken by the masses, became the practical solution. People began to write legal documents in their own tongue. Priests, desperate to reach congregations still reeling from grief, began preaching in English. Suddenly, the language of the commoner became the language of record. It was a quiet revolution. Before the plague, a legal summons might be written in Latin. After the plague, it might be written in Middle English. Monks who once copied scripture in Latin began translating texts into the vernacular. Books once reserved for the elite were now read by merchants, craftsmen, even literate farmers. And then, in 1362, just over a decade after the worst wave of the plague, Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading, declaring that all court proceedings must be conducted in English. Latin and French could remain in the written record, but the spoken word, the public word, would now be English. This was monumental. For the first time in centuries, the voice of the courtroom echoed with the language of the people. And it didn't stop there. In churches, English began to replace Latin in sermons. In universities, more students studied in English. The works of Chaucer, Langland, and others appeared, rich, poetic, grounded in the daily speech of ordinary people. The written word was no longer distant or foreign. It sounded like home. And this shift wasn't just linguistic. It was cultural. The rise of English meant that ideas, laws, and beliefs became accessible. A farmer could now hear a priest speak of sin and salvation in a tongue he understood. A tradesman could read a charter, a contract, a poem. It forged a new kind of national identity, not just of geography or crown, but of shared language. One that had grown, not from victory in war or royal decree, but from survival through death. Ironically, it took a catastrophe to make room for English. The Black Death thinned the ranks of the educated elite and erased the gatekeepers of language. In doing so, it democratized communication. It broke the monopoly of Latin and French and gave English a stage it had long been denied. And once it found its voice, it never looked back. In the centuries that followed, English would evolve, absorbing words from Latin, French, Norse, and beyond. It would become the tool of poets, lawmakers, rebels, and kings. But it was in those grim years of the plague, amid mass graves, shuttered monasteries, and desperate sermons, that the seeds of its rise were planted. And so, when we speak English today, we are speaking the language of survival. A language that rose not from conquest, but from collapse. From the silence of death came the voice of a nation. From the void left by the plague came a tongue that would reshape Britain, and one day the world.